Hi everybody, I wanted to continue our conversation about dissecting your quantitative variables. This is the second video in a 2-video series, so short and sweet. For the first video, we talked about what variables are you measuring. So if you're thinking about your independent, dependent, moderating, mediating variables, what are the names of those variables? How are they defined? And at what level are you measuring? Is it organizational level? Is it team level? Individual level? In this particular video, we're going to focus on understanding the types of variables, their measurement levels or scales, how you would collect data for each of those variables, and then things you need to consider for analyzing those variables. And all of that is to get you to think about what you need to include in your narrative in Chapter 3 and what you need to consider so that you can write about it and plan your study effectively. So let's start by talking about the two types of variables and the different measurement levels within each one. So the two types are categorical and continuous. So let's start with looking at the categorical variables. There are 3 measurement scales here. So a nominal scale has 2 or more categories, but they don't really have an order. Okay, so gender could be one of those, ethnicities, meal preference. A dichotomous measurement scale has only 2 categories with no intrinsic order. So yes, no, pass, fail. And then the last measurement scale is ordinal. So there's 2 or more categories with an intrinsic order, worst, bad, best, better. You can kind of see there's a subtle order to it. Okay. Now, the second type of variable is continuous. Okay. And these lie on a numerical continuum. If it is an interval continuous variable, then it's on a continual measure, but it has an equally spaced measure. Okay, so think about things like temperature or Likert scales or Likert scales. Okay, so anything that's like a 5-point or a 7-point Likert scale is typically considered to have those equally spaced measures. I do want to make a note here. In the GCU template, they talk about Likert scales as being ordinal, so categorical ordinal scales where they have 2 or more categories with an intrinsic order. And then you'll see some define Likert scales as continuous interval. Okay, you should discuss this with your chair on how to approach it. For my study, I approximated my Likert scale variables as continuous and included support and rationale for that by citing research that's out there. So talk to your chair about how you want to approach a Likert scale and how you would measure that and categorize it. Okay. The second type of continuous variable is a ratio variable. So it's similar to an interval scale. It's on a continuous measure, but there's absolute zero. Okay, so there's a starting point. Test scores, height, weight, distance. Those are some examples. Okay, so once you can describe the type of variable and the measurement scale, you want to make sure that you write about that and define it. And I'll show you an example here in a minute. But you also want to think about how you're going to collect your data. And I'm expanding a little bit beyond just the variables. I'm thinking about things like your inclusion and exclusion criteria. How are you going to determine that people meet the inclusion criteria for your study? And one of the things that I recommend is using yes/no questions at the beginning of your survey before the respondents get to the informed consent. Have them answer a series of yes/no questions. Are you based in the United States? Yes. Do you have a degree in early childhood development? Yes. Those kinds of things. You can have them check off yes, no, and if they answer no, then you can automatically have them excluded from your survey. The other thing that you want to think about is how you're going to collect your demographic data. And one thing to think about, especially when you're collecting things like type of industry, job title, is you want to identify whether or not you will allow them to give you multiple answers, or if you want them to give you a single answer. So if you want to understand all the job titles that they've had over their career, then you could have them select multiple. If you want to know what job title they're currently in, then you would want to define just a single answer for that question. Okay, so think about that. That was something I didn't think about when I asked respondents to give me their job titles. They multiple selected. So I had to say that these job titles were represented in the sample, but I could not say that 36 of the 400 and whatever respondents had the title of instructional designer. Okay, so it will affect how you write about your results. And then last but certainly not least is your research data. How are you collecting that information? Most of the time with researched variables, there will be valid and reliable instruments. You can get the manual for those instruments. You have access to validity and reliability research that you can provide as support for use of that instrument. You may also, in some cases, need to create a standalone question or questions to gather additional data. The reason I say that is I created a question in my demographic survey that helped me collect the data that I used for my independent variable. Okay, and let me show you what I mean. So you'll see this is an example from my study. You can just, it's not the perfect example, but it's one way that you can do it, just so you can see how it can be done. So you'll see I've got an independent variable, which was type of work environment, and there's two things I'm looking for here, two categories: working predominantly at home, working predominantly in the office. So this is a categorical dichotomous variable that I used. The data source for that was the demographic survey. Then you can see for my dependent variable of work engagement and moderating variable of psychological capital, both of those used valid, reliable scales that were both Likert scales. So they were approximated as continuous interval. This is the verbiage that my chair asked that I use. Okay. So then you need to consider, how are you going to analyze your variables? Okay. And you think about this variable by variable. Does it need to be coded in any way? If you are doing what I did and doing any sort of group comparison, you will need to code your groups so that SPSS knows which group is which. You'll need to discuss how your scores are calculated, and I'll show you an example here in a minute. And then you need to think about, are you going to use an aggregate score or are you using subconstruct scores? What does that mean? And for me, work engagement is made up of three subconstructs: vigor, dedication, and absorption. I had the option of using each one of those subconstruct scores and doing a comparison across groups. Or I could take all of those scores combined together to get the aggregate score for work engagement, which is what I ended up doing. Okay, so you can write research questions on the total score for work engagement, or I could have written research questions on the subconstructs. So the group differences with vigor, the group differences with dedication, the group differences with absorption. Okay, so things to think about when you're analyzing your data. So let me show you a couple more examples on the scoring. And again, these are how I defined things in my study. In addition to a written narrative, these tables were included. So for the two instruments that required scoring, this table was included in my study. For work engagement, I used the 9-item U-Check work engagement scale. The answer options were 0, which equaled never, all the way up to 6, which equaled always. Okay. How was the score calculated? It was a mean score, so I just explained the totals for each response would be divided by the total number of questions. And then these were the possible ranges of scores that I could get, that respondents could get. Okay. And then I did the same thing for the moderating variable. I used the PCQ-12. Answer options were 1 to 6, strongly agree all the way to disagree to strongly agree. Same thing here, mean score. And then the total ranges were 1 to 6. Okay. For coding, just wanted to mention this for you. For my study, my independent variable had two groups, working predominantly from home and working predominantly in the office. In my study, in the demographic survey, I asked respondents to tell me where they work most of the time. And they were given the option to select one of these. If they selected the top two where they worked at home at least 80% of the time, then they were sorted into group one. If they answered the last two where they worked in the office at least 80% of the time or 100%, they were sorted into group two. And then anyone who kind of split their time evenly was considered ineligible. Okay, so I grouped these into two groups, and that's how I did my analysis. Now, I could go back with my research data and actually do a group comparison across 5 groups and sort them based on the answer options. And I might get a different result or some different information. Okay. Before we close, I just want to note a couple of things. These are things to think about as you're writing your narrative and getting ready to break out the detailed information in your chapter 3. You want to understand the variables. You want to be able to explain how you're going to collect your data, how many questions your survey will be, how you're going to score, what the potential scores could look like. All of that information is included in chapter 3, and hopefully this video gave you some ideas and some things to think about and how you break down and dissect those variables so that you can write about them clearly. So I will see you around, and good luck on your dissertation.